Welcome back to the Voices of War. In today's episode, we're unpacking the concept of Westlessness, the strategic and psychological unraveling of Western dominance, and what it means for the future of global power. What happens when the West is no longer the axis around which the world spins? Who benefits from this shift and who loses? And can the West still lead, not through dominance, but through example? As powers like China and India rise, and blocs like BRICS expand, we're not just witnessing a geopolitical rebalancing, we're also seeing a deeper crisis within the West itself, one marked by cultural fragmentation, moral inconsistency, and a loss of confidence in its own narrative. To help us make sense of this moment, I'm joined today by Dr. Samir Puri, Director of the Centre for Global Governance and Security at Chatham House, Senior Fellow at King's College London, former British diplomat and UN official, and the author of several acclaimed books on the deeper forces shaping our world. This is Samir's second appearance on the Voices of War. Last time we explored his earlier works, The Great Imperial Hangover, which traced how the legacies of empire continue to shape global politics today, and Russia's Road to War with Ukraine, which examined how imperial thinking underpinned Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, as well as the West's strategic response. Today we turn to his latest book, Westlessness, The Great Global Rebalancing, to explore how the erosion of Western dominance is reshaping both the international system and the internal soul of the West itself. Samir, welcome back to the Voice of War.
Good to be with you again. Hi.
So we last spoke on the 8th of December 22, and while much has changed in the world since then, I think your previous two books have stood the test of time, at least since then. And I just finished Westlessness, and I found it even more insightful and perhaps even more timely, especially given the pace of global shifts that we're now witnessing. So perhaps we can start with some of the core concepts of your book. So what do you mean by Westlessness, and how is it different from simply saying Western decline? And is this more a psychological condition than a strategic reality?
Well, first of all, it's interesting to reflect on work that you've written, because once you write a book, the words are locked in. They're out there. So especially writing about geopolitics, things are always changing. So I always aim for intellectual honesty. And you mentioned the Russia's Road to War with Ukraine book. It was published in 2022. And it said that Ukraine can't win, neither can Russia. So this is headed to a de facto partition of territory. And that was not the message people wanted to hear. They wanted to hear Ukraine will win, Russia will be collapsing. Yeah. And
at least the people in the West.
People supporting Ukraine, people in the West say it's not been translated to Russian, let's put it this way. But the fact of the matter is that is what's happening now. And so when you're writing these books, from my perspective, rather than seeking to capture people's kind of faddish understanding of a situation, I'm trying to capture the trend line and to deliver some intellectual honesty. So the Westlessness book is on a much grander scale. It's about the geopolitical changing balance of power, changing world order. And it's honest in the sense it's not sensational. It doesn't say the West is going to collapse. There's a lot in the press because of the Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi meeting in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that says post-American order, post-Western order, new world order. This is not actually accurate. What is accurate is a notion of a fundamental rebalancing from a world that was very much centered around the West, Europe, North America in particular, to a world that is considerably less centered around them and that has rival centers of power and has great powers in the world that are able to forge relations with each other, no matter what the West thinks of those relationships. That's a very, very big change because no one alive today has lived in a world where there's a mixture of Western and non-Western centers of power and influence that are enduring. And that's very novel. Just in terms of whether it's psychological or not, the book deals with the hard power rebalancing, and it also deals, which you can measure to some extent in economics and demographics, and also deals more polemically and more in a more literary fashion with the psychological aspects, because those can't be measured. Clearly, this is anxiety-inducing for people who don't want it to be the case. It's also potentially anxiety-inducing in a different way for those who welcome it, but it ignites different anxieties. The anxiety of feeling like you were never at the top table, and now you can make a grab for that. It can also lead to very rash behaviors like Putin's invasion of Ukraine, where he thinks history is on his side, and he's miscalculated some aspects, but he didn't miscalculate the fact that India and China would be ambivalent, borderline supportive to Russia no matter what the West said. So he got that reading right. He got that trend line correct, probably because, Russia is in Asia. So it seems to understand changing balances of power and the Asian aspect of that better than the Western European.
Mm, mm. And one of the other things I want to pick up on is the idea of Westlessness is not necessarily punishing the West. You're not self-flagellating the West. You're not. This is not white shame. This is not. And we mentioned this in our previous episode as well. That's not what this book is about. It's trying to be, as you say, quite rational and fair about what's going on in the world. And in our own little bubble in the West, that might be quite confronting.
Yeah, totally. If you judge a book by its cover and you see a non-Western heritage name as the author, Samir Puri, someone might walk past and go, well, there's somebody else who hates the West, who's bashing the West, who's using his privilege as someone in the West. Not at all. I'm not interested in doing that. I'm British. I'm from London. My heritage is from India. And the interesting thing is to try as with my Imperial Hangover book, is try to meld the different perspectives that hybridity gives you. And in no way, shape, or form is this a book about bashing the West. It's an honest appraisal of how the West ended up so disproportionately dominant around the world, and not only in terms of military power and in terms of inspiring and dictating how political systems are organized, but also spreading languages and spreading pop culture. And that's the world we've all grown up in, including people who aren't Western, many of whom have partially westernized aspects of their professional identities to get ahead in business, that have very voluntarily, very happily, partially westernized some of their tastes around sports, around music, around films. None of this is bad. This is just a very honest reflection of how a couple of centuries of first European and now US-led sort of Western global influence has led to the world as it is now. And we're not going to experience a great fall from this moment, but we are going to see quite a fundamental rebalancing from this point on. I have a very cheeky chapter title called Peak West, which is my response to I thought, ill-advised Economist magazine headline from a couple of years ago called Peak China. That was all about, China's demography and its economy is so terminal that it won't ever continue its double-digit economic growth into the future. Okay, fair enough. But I think it misses the other point, which is what else is peaking.
And I think that was actually my next question about what is the peak West. So is it a disorientation in the West? Is it a material loss of power and influence and money and wealth, or is this a moral and ideological kind of unraveling or degradation?
So it's a very uneven process, and it doesn't include decline in every metric. So that's the complexity I want to grapple with, is if you're talking about changing world order, a more multipolar world, a more diverse set of international characters having influence, it doesn't happen overnight and in one go. So there's academic work on this, which I cite, which says that when hard power shifts, there's a considerable lag before soft power starts to mirror that shifting pattern. So I think right now where we are, there are very clear metrics that the G7, which is a good proxy for the non-geographic West because it includes the Canadians, Americans, Western Europeans, and Japan. When I was going off to university as an undergraduate, as recently as the early 2000s, the G7 was 65% of the global economy. It's headed to less than 50%, especially because the Japanese and the European economies aren't growing as quickly. The American economy is still a sizable share of the world. But that sort of thing is, it's very, very important to grip that. And there's statistics and there's data that allow you to forward project what that trend line looks like in terms of the West's sort of hard power share. The soft power part is harder to measure, but there are interesting metrics in particular from industry studies around things like the music industry or the film industry or the computer game industry. These are business-oriented metrics that are only interested in the honesty of it because people want to make money. So when you see how many cinemas are being built in China, when you see the country of origin of the most popular free-to-download mobile games, when you see the tallies of the top 10 most lucrative international music acts, singers, and bands, you notice, and these industries are reflecting these changes, that there are more non-Western entrants into these top 10 lists than there were before. Obvious things like marketing K-pop to Westerners, that would never have happened 10 or 15 years ago. But other things around a Bollywood film winning its first Oscar, and more subjective things around the sheer production values of Chinese and Indian films at the highest end of their production spectrum, improving in a very, very short space of time. Ironically, because Hollywood itself outsourced some of its special effects to parts of Asia. But I mean, all of that is all in the book, because I just don't think multipolarity can only be understood by a military parade in China where Xi Jinping and Putin stand there and you see all this. Nor can it only be sort of judged by the big sort of issues of Taiwan and Ukraine. There's also issues around soft power, and they then implicate future senses of culture, identity, and rootedness, and implicit senses of hierarchy, which are, I think most people alive today understand where the sort of senses of hierarchy and prestige and where they sort of radiate from. I think it's a really interesting question to ask ourselves, to question our own assumptions as to what they'll look like and where they'll radiate from and how they'll mix and meld in the future. Because they're not going to be the same as they were today, because today it's already very different to what it was in the 90s. I think most people will agree. And I think most people will agree, and I do have the line at the start of the book, that the pace of change is starting to quicken. It's a sort of book, if you write 5 years ago, people would call you a raving lunatic. Write it as recently as 2024, which is when it came out. A lot of people in the West go, well, I don't really see the point of this, or, what is this? And then this year with the Donald Trump second administration and the fracturing of Western cohesion, which is, again, not something that I predict, but I did say in the first few pages, Western unity cannot be assumed, which is why this cannot be a story of the West versus the rest, because there's no sense of blocks, fixed blocks. Now, of course, when it comes to my paperback edition early next year, there'll be a hefty update, because Donald Trump has hit the fast forward button on a lot of these trend lines. And this is the other thing with trend lines, is certain things can speed them up, certain things can slow them down. It's unlikely they can be stopped entirely unless you have a King Canute view of trying to turn the tides back, sitting on your throne in the shoreline.
Which, in many ways, is what Donald Trump is trying to do, right? I mean, he's trying to really act as the king of the West, and we saw it, even in images when the delegation that went to the White House with Zelensky of the 7 European leaders. I mean, it is very performative, and Trump is really trying to kind of stake his claim on the fact that he's trying to save the US, but also the West. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about the book is that you address the kind of culture wars that the West is experiencing, about identity, really. And we're seeing that play out in the UK. We're seeing it play out right now in Australia, where there's contest around the Australian flag, and is it okay to wave the Australian flag, or is that seen as too nationalistic? Is that seen as too right-wing leaning? How do you place this in the context of Westlessness, this internal dynamic within much of the West?
Yeah, so the book is more about the international scene, but you cannot help but mention the impact of this on Western countries as part of the book. And there's two sides to this. The first is one of the enduring strengths of Western countries is that someone like me, family can arrive in the 70s.
And me.
And yourself, and in Australia,
Yeah.
respectively, and then we can actually integrate and play an important role or an interesting role in your career in civic life of the country. And there's no kind of color bar to that. That's an enormously important attribute of Western countries. There's a difference in doing that in a world in which the Western countries are very dominant to a world in which they become a bit less dominant. And what I find interesting, and it's a pure correlation, it's not causation, is the populism, certainly in the US of MAGA, but also in Western European countries, has correlated with this moment when the Western countries collectively aren't as globally dominant as they were. No one makes that link because it's always for the populists, immigration. We don't want immigration. We want to control it. We don't want the dilution of our identity. But I do think there's a set of underexplored anxieties that are quite pervasive, especially in European countries, where there's a very palpable sense that the world is going to influence us, perhaps more than we influence the world. And when you juxtapose that with a historical pattern of the last couple of hundred years, it doesn't implicate anybody alive today in the deeds of their forefathers, not at all. That's not my point. It's just very simply that from the West, influence radiated out. And some of that influence was really positive in terms of spreading aspects of 19th and 20th century modernity, medicine, and other things like this. Others, of course, in the more ugly phases of colonialism were quite negative. But it doesn't matter whether they're positive or negative, they were radiating out. And, you see this not only with populists, but even in something as shocking as North Korean troops fighting in the Russian bit of the Russia-Ukraine war. That's a huge security challenge for Europeans. That's it's a catastrophe for those who are looking to stabilize Europe. That's without a question. It is also a very visceral, very shocking illustration of the notion that events, in this case from Asia, can actually directly impact the security of Europe. And I don't think that's going to be repeated necessarily, but I think it's a sort of thing that you could never have imagined happening just a few years ago in any sort of shape or form. And it's this point of direction of travel of influence I want to get into in the book. Now, you can't predict future events, but you can start to talk about a slight change that becomes a gradual change and eventually becomes a very, very big change. And I think that the anxiety-inducing aspects of this are going to be a lot of fodder for more nationalist, inward-looking political movements across Western countries, even if they primarily make reference to economic and socio-economic dynamics that are domestic.
Yeah. I mean, it's that identity piece and the fear and the anxiety that's induced that I find really interesting. And like you said, I mean, there's a shift from outwards to inwards. Can the West do anything about that? Because ultimately, the West, as you describe it, heavily relies on this kind of import of, I guess, firstly migration, but also the blending of cultures. And now, when you're at a point where these cultures are clashing, and there's this drive for nationalism and conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement theory, etc. These are all finding kind of ground to kind of grow in and fester. How does the West even begin to wrestle with this in a way that's not going to further divide it?
So the first thing is communities do get along in Western countries. It's just the populists suggest sometimes that they don't. And I suppose that the main answer I'd give is it's not on the domestic side, because that is not at all the focus of the book. It's not my expertise. It's not really for me to tell sort of Western countries from a civic perspective how to manage this. The one reflection I have on it in the book, and the only one, is it's because this book is about the international system. It's about world order. The one reflection I have is that when you have people of diverse backgrounds coming to Western countries, when the Western countries were so dramatically richer and more successful than their country, the person's country of origin, I think the idea that the Western identity part was the dominant part was very easy to sell. I'm just thinking in particular about Chinese origin communities in different Western countries, in different countries around the world. Uh, they may well be very, very integrated, and Indian communities. They may well be very integrated into the countries they now live in, but it means something different to have Chinese or Indian heritage if China or India is suddenly extremely powerful globally. That's not to mean there's going to be any disloyalty, but I would be foolish not to reflect on the fact that when I was growing up, India was a very poor country. It was not cool. And the aspects of my Indian identity were not really things to brag about, because things that were Western or American were just better. In 30 years' time, if India is indeed the world's third biggest economy and leapfrogs in various developmental indicators, continues its space program, continues to market culture that is more digested by other parts of the world, then managing a hybrid identity, even in a Western country, will have a different dynamic to it. And it's only about, I think, realizing that there's change afoot in how layered identity, many people have layered identities, but in realizing how layered identities will function in a world where the international hierarchy has shifted. So a couple of very complex dynamics, but I don't see too many people thinking about those, but I would be fairly certain that in the next few decades, there will be change in motion, especially for newer generations who are just born with a blank canvas view of the world, with a view of international hierarchies that are very, very different to those of those born in the 70s, 80s.
I think you brought that out really well in the book when you talked about the top universities and the change in the top universities. So the kind of aspiration of becoming the most you can be. There's been a gradual but a definitive shift in much more, certainly China appearing a lot more frequently in the top universities of the world, which for the next generation is a genuine consideration. Do I try to go to Oxford, or do I try to go to Shanghai Uni? Which is likely to give me better prospects for succeeding in the world?
Yeah, and that's another one where Donald Trump has fast forwarded the decline of appeal in the USA as a graduate location. That's an obvious point, isn't it? But even if there's a very divided USA without Trump in a few years' time, the cost benefit for a bright IT student in India, or a South Korean student, or various people from around the world who have been flocking to the USA, that analysis might be a bit different. Of course, British universities and Aussie universities at the moment, they've got this sudden windfall where they can try to get some of this demand because traveling for study is a great privilege and something that people are going to continue doing. But again, it's just worth not being complacent that the relative advantage that Western universities have had in educating some of the best and brightest in the world is a permanent advantage, because the quality of the offering will change in different parts of the world.
Yeah, I think the quality of offering, I think that's across the board, is really what's going to shape the future. One of the aspects of your book that I really enjoyed was the question of moral authority, and how the values or the interests of the West have kind of brought through its hypocrisy. And I think one of the key aspects there was Gaza, the response towards Israel on one hand, and then of course the response to Russia against Ukraine. We saw very diverse responses from what we would consider the West. Is this perceived hypocrisy one of the drivers of Westlessness, as seen from the countries outside of the West?
Yeah, so I think listeners and viewers will be now aware that this book has different chapters that look at different metrics of Western power and influence, and honestly questions whether they are heading towards our expiry date, whether they're challenged or whether they're holding firm. So it distinguishes between the ones that are holding firm versus the ones that are fading. And the chapter on moral power is the one where I think there's actually a very, very big problem. And it's not that hypocrisy is like this sudden thing, oh God, the West is hypocritical. Listen, foreign policy is an exercise in hypocrisy. Consistency in principles across a very varied set of issues and crises that are suddenly hitting you. Issues that are more proximate to you because of geography and more distant from you because of, again, the geography again. That is just the story of foreign policies. Consistency, moral consistency in foreign policy is not something you can aspire towards. The observation is that the accusation of Western hypocrisy lands differently in a global theatre where the West is less unchallenged versus one where it's very dominant. So of course there's that whole wave of accusation around the Iraq invasion that the US, the British, the Australians, and others were implicated in over 20 years ago now. 22 years ago, 2003. There was no challenge from China. There's no sense of a parallel set of institutions in global governance. There's no claim that the global South could unite it around other visions in 2003 when the Iraq invasion took place. Today, with some countries, and particularly the USA, but not only the USA, other countries have got themselves into quite a conundrum around the Gaza conflict, which I don't want to go into specifically too much. The accusation of hypocrisy carries a very different price. And it's quite considerable, I think, because the ability of the Chinese to advance themselves as a paragon of stability is enhanced by images of Trump giving Netanyahu a blank check to resume the war in Gaza. And it's also, and now it's so interesting that South Africa has led the International Court of Justice case. South Africa is effectively taking the lead on behalf of others, because there are others who have then piled their support behind. South Africa is not anywhere near Gaza. It's a global South country, a member of the BRICS, and it is using a European-located court in The Hague to bring this moral case. South Africa has played a big role in moving the moral needle on this argument globally, to the point that governments in Canada, France, and Britain, which have only recently officially said they support the two-state solution, they're not following South Africa, but they are lagging behind the broad consensus around sort of parts of the global South, of course, the Islamic world, that something needs to be done to restrain Israel or to stop it. That is a changed reality from 30 years ago, when South Africa was still sanctioned for apartheid. But even 20 years ago, the idea that a global South country could be one of the moral leaders in changing the tone of debate globally around an issue that doesn't directly affect it, but is of global moral consequence,
Mm.
I think is again an interesting indicator of how fast things have changed. And you'll notice I'm not trying to pass judgment on any party as I try to speak. I'm not trying to be diplomatic for the sake of it. Genuinely,
Hmm.
the book is like, make your own mind up about these issues. But what I'm trying to look at is the extent to which the West is leading or following
Mm.
on these various themes, is dictating the pace of change, or is in itself, responding to changes being driven by others. Where is it
Mm.
isolated? Where is it part of the world? I don't believe in this phrase, the global majority, but I do think there is a significant empowerment different parts of the non-Western world because they're also working together with greater sense of
Mm.
commonality, solidarity, or sometimes just lowest common denominator agreements on topics that put them on one side of an argument and the US and some Western governments on another side.
Yeah. No, I really do echo that sentiment that your book is not about judgment. You do not pass judgment. It's about trying to understand the big moving pieces and how they intersect rather than diving down into one's bubble and dying on one sword over this culture war, that culture war, right? Which is what we're seeing a lot. That's what captures our attention.
Well,
But
man,
this is,
if I did
yeah.
that on Twitter and built up 1 million followers, I'd sell many more books. Listen, there are many polemicists and shoot from the hip die on my sword, exactly as you say, taking a particular view. Often it's a heartfelt view, sometimes it's just a very superficial view. But that is the nature of
Mm.
discourse. Yeah,
Mm.
then within that, there is still a need for very honest analysis, because at the end of the day, governments, companies, and individuals want to place themselves in an advantageous position, in a morally virtuous position, one would hope as well, in a fast changing world, and to make themselves more robust against change and risk and different pressures. And because all of those calculations are changing very, very rapidly, there is an onus on bringing together different strands of analysis. And I like the way you put it, trying to bring all the moving pieces together into this. And it's interesting, if my book was a piece of machinery, it would be, cogs here, rivets here, pipes there, it would be all sorts of things. But that's part of the joy of engineering something that's so many different pieces, because the engineering challenges is immense and arguably insurmountable. But you have to have working machinery to try to move through this period of change.
Yeah, and I think you do that really well. You step outside, you show us the machine or the systems that are functioning. I think that's one of the hard bits is to step out into the macro world because we are bombarded at the micro level. We are bombarded every single day and incentivized to react to micro moments in history. But when you zoom outside and look at the patterns of behavior over, in some instances, decades, I think that's where you start really comprehending what Westlessness really means. It's not the West is gone. It's just that the center of power of the West is being challenged credibly across several other centers of power. And I do want to get to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which just recently held its summit. What did you make of it? You've mentioned it a few times, but there were some quite significant scenes, I think, between Modi, Putin, and Xi. Chuckling together. There's this kind of there's a real sense of camaraderie when looking at it from the outside. Of course, the SEO is not as kind of well constructed just yet, or doesn't gel as well because there are internal dynamics that restrict it from doing so. But what do you make of the
Yeah.
latest SEO summit, and then of course the military parade afterwards?
Yeah, so it turns out it's much more significant than this year's BRICS summit. I don't think that means that the SCO is more significant than the BRICS. I think it will vary. Brazil hosted the BRICS this year, 2025, but Brazil is also hosting COP. And as anyone who's ever been
Mm.
a civil servant will tell you, there's only so much, you know, resource that you can put behind two massive global events. So I suspect Brazil will probably put a bit more oomph behind COP. And climate change. And also, the BRICS summit happened just after Israel bombed Iran, and Iran is now a BRICS member. So there was a sort of a difficulty of timing. The SCO this year in Tianjin it's been a huge moment for multiple reasons. One of which is to show that Vladimir Putin correctly read the room with regards to changing world order. All that trope about, he miscalculated the invasion, he 3-day invasion, doesn't understand Ukraine will survive. Absolutely correct. But why is it that people only say those things and don't say the thing that he got correct, which was the ability to buttress his sanctioned economy with rising Asian powers? As I mentioned at the start, because of that, I think, more intuitive grasp of Asia because of they're your neighbors. There's that. There's also the sight of Kim Jong-un, Putin, and Xi Jinping on the military parade, which creates this acute sense of coordinated security threat. But what I would say is, and I don't blame you for phrasing your question this way, Maz. There's always a fixation, especially in the West, that the SCO and the BRICS aren't coordinated and don't have like-minded countries with deep value bonds. And I shake my head at this because it mirror images the way that we understand collective action in the West, which is arguably quite contractual. So there's a sort of sense of like a codified alliance. There's a legalistic tradition of going about these things. Because we so hold our democracies as such core parts of our personal and political and sort of philosophical identities, that the commonality of values that those systems, as they mirror each other, then provides this article of faith that these are bonded, bound entities. But, we don't then go into the idea that NATO is also bonded by the ancestral commonality of Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans and their emigres to the New World when settler colonialism displaced the Red Indians. That is not part of the story, but that is also the reason why we talk about tight bonds of the transatlantic relationship. And I think we need to be as flexible in understanding organizations like BRICS and SCO on their own terms. The idea that if global South countries get together and they had a broadly comparable chronology post-independence, as in the last sort of 70, 80 years, that doesn't mean they all suddenly understand each other telepathically, but it means that there may be areas that they have a sense of common understanding of the flow of history that is not accessible to the Western countries. Maybe there's issues of geographical proximity in Asia and elsewhere that mean that there are some broadly commonly experienced phenomena, again, through history and through geography, that mean that there is a greater sense of lack of comprehension. And there's all sorts of things, I think, around why does India like Russia that is just impenetrable to some Westerners. It's also impenetrable to me. But when I worked in Ukraine, I'll never forget sitting in the back of a taxi, and this old Ukrainian chap, who's assumed I was from India fairly unreasonably, started talking to me about Bollywood films. And a bit with him, and he was telling me that they were broadcast in the USSR every week. And it was actually a big deal. And so, why has culture in some cases crossed between Russia and India? Again, and I mention this in the book because it is significant. In 2023, the highest grossing Bollywood film stars Shah Rukh Khan's called Pathan. It's a ridiculous film, obviously. It's a funny action film, but it has a section in Moscow, in the middle part of it, where he is deployed to Russia on a mission. And there's this great bit of fictional script. He's a government officer. His boss in the Indian government tells him before he goes to Russia, a scandal will not be tolerated because these are our friends when you go to Russia. So it's just a little bit of little Bollywood messaging that parallels the official policy. And I'm not saying all Indians love Russia and vice versa, not at all. But I do think that these relationships are very cynically interpreted in the West. They're not really interpreted for what they actually are. And they're definitely not interpreted from the notion that from very different start points, a more multipolar world is very desirable to some of these countries for their own. For Russia, it's to violently challenge the West, which is awful. For India, it's to have a seat at the top table of world affairs and to prepare the way for itself as it believes itself it's going to become the world's third largest economy. That's the wording of sort of Indian officials in the last little while. So it's a very complex world. There's a multiplicity of perspectives on it, and the ability to ignore perspectives that don't correlate with yours is dropping.
I also find this tension between values and interests quite poignant here, because I think we have a tendency in our bubbles, in our domestic bubbles, to judge behavior of other nations through this value lens, about being the right or the good, or these are the Axis, they're autocrats. So there's this kind of value judgment about these systems. Straight away, they look down upon them. Whereas when we step up into the interests of the halls of power in the West, they are governed by interests, not by values. I mean, the reason Australia supported the US in Afghanistan and Iraq was purely out of interest. The reason why the US is supporting Israel is interests. All of these things are questionable when you boil down to the actual values that it represents, but we are just unable to step back and afford the same, I guess, respect to other non-Western nations who are also acting out of their interest. But we kind of just tarnish them with this brush of poor values or poor judgment or evil or whatever. Pick your cultural theme that you want to throw in there to kind of incite some aggravation, I guess.
Yeah, one always has to be careful that, you know, this is not a book written to be sort of an apologist for Russian or Chinese regime, and
of course, no,
not live.
absolutely, it's
I'd
not.
much
Yeah,
rather not live in either country. To be honest
yes,
with you, I much prefer living in a country that correlates more closely with my values. But there is something about separating your preferences from the diversity of the world. There is something about this which is very, very complex because, again, the West has radiated this extraordinary and very well deserved confidence in its political systems and political cultures as actually being better, better for the world, better for others. I think where we're headed towards is a much more blended reality where there are more countries that have aspects of democracy and other aspects in their governing traditions. And so they're not all going to be, you know, quite repressive police states like the Russian states. They'll and there won't be, you know, like Denmark. They'll be somewhere in between, and they may actually increasingly be a bit closer to wanting continuity and from one generation to the next, rather than very messy electoral campaigns. Let's not underestimate the self defeating power of the way populism, especially in the US, has presented a certain style of money-driven democracy in the eyes of others. It was until quite recently very reasonable to point to political systems in Western countries and say, "Well, you do want this because this is obviously a better system." It's now very
mm,
questionable that that will land that well with people all over the world. They say, "Great, well, okay, America, you've more or less merged your democratic selection process with celebrity culture." And there's always the issue of money to support political campaigns. But then there's also the fairly reasonable point that because social media targeting of political campaign messages is now, the techniques are not that distinguishable from marketing products,
mm,
that actually the manipulability of people's sensibilities is more advanced because technology has moved forward. And I do dwell on this point. Again, it's just because liberal democracy is very associated with the West as an export, as a point of aspiration, as a point of pride, rightfully so. But
mm,
technology is not empowering its export potential. Let's put it this way, because technology
mm,
has severely problematized its practice domestically, as anyone in any Western country knows. As long as you're sort of over 30, literally the elections that you lived through when you were a teenager to the ones you're living through now are just very different because of social media.
mm,
And it's happened in the space of 10 to 15 years, and we're all grappling with that. And I have every confidence that Western countries will understand how to do this through voter education, regulation of tech companies. I think there's going to be a very difficult journey. And in that time, more technocratic, less Western style systems will start to do very well economically in other parts of the world.
mm,
And
mm.
again, I'm not imposing my preference on the analysis. I think it would just be very, very ignorant to not pay attention to the comparative dynamic that is unfolding in quite a quick space of time.
Is it possible that this might be a fairer world when the balance of power has been equated or it's been shared across several centers of power?
Um, the big problem is that the passage to a more multipolar world that is, in a kind of a rainbow nation way, fairer because there's a greater plurality of influences. Like the end result of a multipolar world could definitely be better than more unbalanced international systems we've had in the past. The problem we've got is the journey there, because any transition in balances of power and senses of hierarchy are awkward and they're filled with hazard. And I mean, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 is one indication of that already, where Putin, you know, thought that the global balance of power is changing, and the other economies will back him when the West, you know, obviously criticizes what he's doing in Ukraine. He's correct, actually, as I've said. You know, this is the third time I'm saying that. It's very profoundly important, but it means that there are others who may seek advantage as the pieces of the puzzle are thrown up in the air. let's see if we can quickly rearrange them before someone tries to put the puzzle back, or frankly, just take them all away and replace them with an entirely different set of jigsaw pieces. So when you reassemble it, it's all very, very different. I do think that avoiding World War III is now, I think people generally understand, and this is all of a sudden on the table as a serious concern. We have to get through a couple of quite difficult decades, potentially, in which the global equilibrium is clearly broken down. And it'll have to be refashioned, but in a very different way. Because anyone who thought, sort of especially US hawks on the China issue, thought that they could contain and block and reverse China's rise are deluded. And anyone in Asia has, I think, always been very pained to hear this notion that actually China can be beaten. And that's a manifestation of US status anxiety, which is an important feature of what this book is also discussing, because the status anxiety is not experienced equally across the Western nations. In the US, it's very much of the superpower, great power, top of the tree variety. And we're seeing that daily. You don't need to talk about that. There is a daily sense from the way the US is approaching foreign, especially economic policy, that it is out to do everything it can to defend number one status, even now at the expense of its allies, which is not something I would have predicted. But ask any Canadian how this year feels in relation to the US attempting to safeguard its privileged position in the world, not its privileged position as a leadership of the West, but looking out for number one.
Itself, yeah.
And that is not, of course, the view of all Americans, but that is the view of this administration, and we're even a quarter of the way into its lifespan.
Yeah, I'm conscious of our time, and perhaps my last question to you is the path ahead, really, and you do touch on that in the book. You finish off the book. Can the West still reimagine itself, not as a dominant force, but as one that's a constructive contributor to global order? And what would that perhaps look like in practice?
Absolutely. And I mean, the work I'm leading at Chatham House is looking very specifically at this. And I think Western countries have still got enormous amounts to offer the world. This is not, oh, you sinned in the past and now the world order is changing and off you go, hide in your hovels and hide your head in shame. Quite the opposite. Western countries have, I'm thinking also from a European perspective here, have got this extraordinary heritage and pedigree in steering global conversations. Sometimes these have not been in the right directions, but especially since the end of colonial empire, there has been a commitment, certainly in Europe, to moving beyond the ravages of war, because World War II is the dominant experience there. But I just think the ability to understand which lessons land well in the global south and in the wider world, and how to communicate those messages, where to find commonality in different parts of the world, that is all now in flux. And I think a sort of a very complacent sense of, well, we are the most modern part of the world. We've got past World War II and this is it. No, there's actually an enormous amount else that now needs to be thought about. And I think there needs to be, and I don't think it's even a straight composition with the rival offerings of China. I think it's actually much more subtle than that. I think there are many, many countries in the world that want to be actively multi-aligned. And learning from a Western perspective to operate in the world of multi-alignment and multipolarity is an extraordinary learning curve. We're all on that. I don't have like an answer to that, but I think we can at least start posing the right questions to start to work out the most productive paths forward.
Yeah, and I think avoiding World War III should be the top of that list.
Top of the list, but not the only thing, because if you securitize this entire debate, you end up with us versus them equation.
Yeah.
And there are very real security concerns posed by Russia and China, don't get me wrong. But that is not the beginning and ending of what needs to be considered. There are issues around governance, there are issues around commonality of interests on non-security issues. There are issues also, as I mentioned, about identity and the extent of westernization and how that will change, that all need to be factored into a more holistic understanding of the movement for the future.
Absolutely. On that note, Samir, I must admit, I've read now 3 of your books, and this one I enjoyed the most, perhaps because it's so timely. I also had it in audiobook format, so it was read by none other than you. So I thought that was also a nice little touch. But no, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for writing it, and look forward to whatever you come up. What are you working on next? You mentioned briefly what you're working on, but
Oh, well, it's
personally,
the paperback. There's always a delay between the hardbacks and the paperbacks, and I mean, I'm just waiting to see how much else changes this year before you hit save
yes.
on the draft. So that's it. But Matt, thank you so much for having me back on, and for reading the books and for engaging with them. And I'm also really pleased that the approach taken on these topics, empires, Russia and Ukraine, and now sort of multipolarity. These are topics that lots of people are discussing. And it's really interesting to have this conversation with you because you really understand sort of the value of the approaches I've taken on these topics, and I'm really thankful for that.
Thank you, and we'll be in touch for your next book.
Brilliant. Okay, all the best. Bye bye.
Thanks, Samir.